Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. As the federal government prepares to release its 2024 budget, the C.D. Howe Institute has done the same. In its commentary titled Less for Ottawa, More for Canadians, the Institute argues that federal government spending is too high and growing too fast, and that threatens to burden Canadians with debt and what it refers to as growth-stifling taxes. The Institute's shadow federal budget for 2024 restrains spending, balances the budget, and makes a down payment on tax policies it believes will support future prosperity. Meet Bill Robson. He is the CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute and co-author of the report alongside Don Drummond, the Stauffer Dunning Fellow at Queen's University and a Fellow in Residence at the C.D. Howe Institute. They join us now. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Bill, you write that federal government spending is too high and growing too fast. How so?
If you go back only to 2019, so not to the beginning of the first Liberal government, but just to the last fiscal update that we got before COVID hit, spending in the fiscal year that's about to start was pegged at a little bit more than $400 billion. And then we had COVID and, as everybody knows, a whole lot of income support measures and emergency debt finance spending. But what's been happening as you sort of go through COVID and the unwinding of the COVID measures is there's just been this relentless increase in the projected spending for the fiscal year that's about to start. So the one that we're profiling in our shadow budget and that Chrystia Freeland is going to be putting front and center in her budget in the spring. And it's now well over $500 billion. There's been more than $100 billion worth of a higher kind of baseline spending. Remember, this is after the COVID measures are over and done with. So that's been kind of happening behind the scenes. Essentially, that's all being debt financed. I mean, it's not that they're borrowing $100 billion more than what they said they would, but if you look at the increase in debt over that time, we've had about $400 billion worth of extra debt piled on. And our concern is that this has kind of established a crazy baseline for what needs to happen in the future. We're sort of numb to these numbers now. And when we look at the longer-term fiscal track and we think about things like, are we ready for whatever comes next, whether it's another pandemic or it's the stresses of demographic change, stresses from climate, the recessions that are going to happen from time to time, we're very uneasy about that trajectory. And so for us, the very first order of business is to lay out a fiscal track that gets the budget back to balance, stops the growth in the debt, and essentially prepares the country for whatever might come next. And we've got some ideas about that, but that's kind of the essential stage setting exercise.
Well, let's talk about those ideas. Don, what do you see as the measures to rein in this trend to ensure future prosperity?
Well, first of all, we want to see a cap put on program spending. Even when we were doing the work ourselves, we were kind of staggered a little bit by how much we were proposing to cut out of spending. It's taking the level of spending from the fall economic statement by 2028 and reducing it by 4%. That seems to be quite a bit. Well, wait a minute. Let's look at it from the other perspective. What's left? Even after our cuts, program spending will be growing about 5%, either from 2015 base or 2019. That's a lot of spending. That should allow you to do whatever priorities you wish to pursue. So I think we've been deceived a bit at thinking that we're cutting from this fictional level that's been put out and, as Bill says, keeps rising and rising. So let's pick a more modest level of spending. Let's get a philosophy. If you want to spend something new, if you want to introduce pharmacare, for example, that has to come out of that envelope. Something else is no longer number one priority if something new becomes a lower priority. And then we want to see a more thorough review of spending. We get these occasional reviews, and they basically said we spent $400 million and we observed a few jobs created, therefore it must be great. Oh, we said, no, you didn't create any jobs. You took $400 million out of someone's pocket and you spent it out of a different pocket. That's not good enough. We want to see a more robust measure, and we'd like to see actually a proper test for new spending. The example, this huge subsidy for battery production, the test apparently is just, will it pay for itself and enhance revenues? But that doesn't mean there's a social benefit for Canadians. That's not a very rigid test whatsoever. So put a cap on it and scrutinize spending more closely.
Bill, you've said that the federal government's 2023 fall economic statement confirmed a troubling lack of concern about fiscal excess. What strategies should Ottawa deploy using the measures that Don has cited to correct this trajectory?
I think a couple of things are worth underlining. Don has already talked about the need for rigor in program review of a kind that we haven't had in decades now. And I thoroughly subscribe to that. In fact, I'll just embellish a little bit what Don said. In the shadow budget, we take a look at some of the measures that are in the tax system, and therefore they don't show as spending. But there are a lot of tax expenditures that really ought to receive the same scrutiny that they would get if they were programs. As Don's indicated, some of that scrutiny is a little bit perfunctory right now, but it's better than having something that just like the so-called GST credit. It's an income support program. It's a valuable program. There's no doubt about that, but it's got nothing to do with how much GST that you pay. So put that over onto the spending side of the ledger. Have that, just for example, that's a fairly large dollar amount, but there are many more. And we'd like to see some more attention paid to those because they act just like spending programs and they certainly have the same impact on the bottom line. The area that I would really laser in on is the federal government's own compensation costs. The head count is way up. Federal public service is, give or take, about a third larger than it was before. And it's hard when you look at the frontline services to say, okay, well, we've seen that kind of a proportional improvement in what they're doing. Transfer payments are another thing. As Don was saying, you take $1 out of one person's pocket, you put it into another person's pocket. The person who receives it is grateful. But the operating costs themselves, that's just, resources that are being used up that we could probably deploy better elsewhere. Then the final point I'll make, people can overthink the question of whether a balanced budget is a good target. Many economists make quite reasonable arguments that if you stabilize debt to GDP, there are other types of measures that work. But I think that anybody who's worked in a budgeting exercise in their household or in a business or a not-for-profit knows there's nothing quite like that need for getting to zero on the bottom line. Preferably a surplus, but at least not a loss. Because that's the type of constraint that causes you to say when you're thinking, hey, I got a great idea to spend $1 here, to then proceed to, okay, now where am I going to get it from? Where am I going to spend $1 less, or how am I going to raise $1 in revenue? That type of thing just has not been evident with this government for many years now. And you really, I think, need that hard bottom line target in order to induce people to think that way, which is how you get proper stewardship of money.
Well, let's expand on the proper stewardship of money, particularly considering we've got some pretty serious crises looming on the horizon. How do we address the evolution of Canada's population demographics as the largest generation outside of millennials will start leaving the workforce, so they're not contributing in that respect, and there's going to be a bigger burden on healthcare as a result as well?
That's one of the major points of context for the shadow budget. Should you expect everything to be smooth sailing in the future? And we would say, no, that's not the proper way of planning. There was a time, to be precise, around 2006, that many people in policy and many economists thought, you know what, this proved to be pretty simple. If you can keep inflation low and steady, you're not going to have wild economic swings. No sooner did everybody hit it, we got hit over the head with the financial crisis. We had a recession after that. Okay, SARS was pretty bad, but not that big as that. Then we get hit with a pandemic, the likes of which we'd never seen in our lifetimes, and it keeps going on. You got to think that's not the end of that. And then we just get one climate change disaster after another. We got a flood, we got a fire, we got floods and fires at the same time, and the cost of them keep rising. You have to think a reasonable basis to assume it's not all going to be smooth sailing. And then you've got the trend aspects, the aging that you referred to. Well, that slows the economic growth rate by slowing the labor force. But aging adds about 1 percentage point of growth. So if healthcare is going to grow 5%, otherwise it's going to grow 6% because you spend more on older people. So you've got those trend headwinds as well. You don't want to go in there carrying a burden. And yet, if you look back at the fall economic statement, it says nothing to see here. The debt-to-B ratio is a bit over 40, but don't worry, we're going to bring it slightly under 40%. That's pretty high. Interest on public debt eats up about 14% of your revenues, so you've only got 86 cents on the dollar to invest in the future to finance public cares. that's a lot of burden that's not giving you any insurance against the likelihood there's going to get difficulty, which is why we say you got to get back to a balanced budget quickly, and you got to get that debt burden down. We should be very thankful the debt burden was more modest in 2020 because it gave the flexibility. We should have learned this lesson. We needed that flexibility, and a more manageable debt burden gave it. We're not going to have it the next time around if we don't make this fiscal correction.
I'm going to come in right where Don stopped there, Michael, because I totally agree with the need for us to be thinking about the flexibility that we benefited from in the past. You want to restore that. And then the slightly larger picture, I think I'm just triple underlining what Don said. We know that the fiscal stresses associated with aging are coming. COVID kind of hit fast forward on that. What are we doing passing to the next generation a bigger burden of public debt when all of those stresses that we knew were coming are now just that much closer? In the shadow budget, we do a couple of other things as well, because demography was very much on our minds. We have measures, and this is not news. The government was going to do it, and then there was a change in government, and they rescinded it. But you've got to raise the regular age of receipt for OAS. You can continue to allow people who need the money earlier to take it at a reduced rate, because that's what we've been doing for a few years now. I think that adds a lot of flexibility. And then when you look at people's ability to save for retirement, we've got provisions that would make it easier for people to put a little bit more money aside during their working years. People in defined benefit pension plans can save effectively more than people in RRSPs and defined contribution pension plans. We've got some measures to even that out. And then once you're retired, you ought not to be forced to draw your savings down as quickly as you do now. So there are a couple of things on the public support side, and then a couple of things in the tax area that I think we ought to be doing to just get ready for that demographic transition that's upon us. And for those who are able to provide for themselves, make it easier for them to do so, and then make sure the OAS program is going to be sustainable over the long haul, even as we get older.
Bill, you're not going to be making any friends with this shadow budget. You're suggesting that we raise the old age security payout. Within the working class, you're recommending rescinding the temporary exemption of home heating oil from the carbon tax. Nor are you going to win any friends at the Toronto Club by revoking the luxury tax on high-end cars, boats, or jets. You're pulling more money off the table at a time when we need more of that cash.
Well, some of the tax measures that we zero in on in this shadow budget actually aren't going to raise much revenue. There's in the alternative minimum tax, you didn't mention that one, but that's one that's very much on people's minds, because it's going to affect the way that we currently relieve capital gains tax on people who gave the money away when they had securities that appreciated in value. If you change that tax, there's not going to be a lot of revenue, because the activity that you're now taxing is going to stop. And I think the same is true with some of these other taxes that they have put in recently that were very much inspired by kind of populism, such and such. People are mad at banks, people are mad at grocers next. You never know which way it's going to go. A lot of that stuff it's not good for the tax system to have that kind of thing in it. It doesn't raise a lot of revenue because, of course, people try and avoid taxes. And so some of the measures that we've got in the shadow budget are just straightforwardly stop poking holes in the tax system, stop using it for, short-term political gain, restore it more to its function of raising revenue. You didn't mention, though, a really big one, which won't win us any friends, and that's the suggestion that we should put the GST rate back up to 7%. Do I expect to see that in any real federal budget anytime soon? I do not. But what it does is it underlines the size of the fiscal gap that we've created now with all this spending. Every time you add another $10 billion to federal spending without any provision for paying for it, what you're doing is you're saying sooner or later we're going to raise the GST by a percentage point. So I'm not keen about that measure myself, and politically it's a very tough one. But if we're going to spend the way we're spending, we can't just keep borrowing it. We got to come to grips with the need to finance it or spend less.
Don, I've talked to Bill extensively about this one particular issue he just sort of touched on. So let me get your take on this. And the idea is that we need to address the issue of government-mandated cartels in eggs, dairy, poultry products. These cartels were set up to protect farmers from cheap American products. But your commentary argues that they impose high costs on consumers. The shadow budget recommends phasing out these practices. Is there the political will for something like that?
Well, in politics, it's hard to understand why there's not. And there's about 10,000 dairy farmers, and there's about 40 million Canadians who consume the product. That doesn't seem like an even balance. We're not saying just to abandon the agricultural sector. We're saying to phase it out, to deal with the quota system. But we all know any Canadian who's ever gone to the United States, and you look at the price of the equivalent price there or elsewhere in the world, know we're paying an awful lot. And the politics are focused on this problem, the high rate of increase in grocery problems. Everybody's talking about it. There's an attempt to put the narrative on the margins of the grocery stores, which has not been the problem. They're not particularly high. This is actually overwhelming. Yes, you are going to affect a small segment of the population, but you're going to have a benefit for a large segment. How can that not be a political winner if it's addressed properly?
I might, Michael, thanks for mentioning that. It's a bit of a tucked-in thing in the shadow budget, but it did seem to make sense given what Don just said about people's concerns about the cost of living. I will also mention one of the biggest irritants in Canada-U.S. trade relations is the supply management system. It does make the cost of 4 liters of milk $1 higher in Canada on average than what it would cost you to buy the same thing in the United States. None of us is looking forward to a Trump presidency particularly, but we're going to be into renegotiating. I'll call it the NAFTA. It's got a new name now, but I kind of I'm a retro guy. I'll call it NAFTA. Those renegotiations are coming up soon. The supply management system is going to be in the crosshairs, and if we don't resolve it, what we're going to find is that other exports that Canada would like to more market access for, including some high value added stuff, our trade partners, especially the United States, are just not going to be willing to make any trade concessions to us if we're digging our heels in on supply management. So it's actually quite a negative for us. It's a bit of a millstone around our necks as well as costing consumers. And we're not going to see any action on it in the very short term. In fact, there's been a recent effort to forbid Canada from ever making trade concessions in the supply management area. But over the long term, we got to grow up. We've got to get rid of this system. Australia had one, they got rid of it. New Zealand had one, they got rid of it. It's time for us to get rid of ours.
Yeah, and as the shadow budget mentions, the need for reducing the cost of basic groceries is sort of tied into that, and that your argument is that we need to improve Canada's negotiating position internationally, and we can't do that if there is a system in place that protects one group over another.
Well, yeah, so the deal, the way we ought to express this deal is it's like Trump with his tariffs, right? Who paid those tariffs? Americans paid those tariffs. He liked to impose tariffs on the Chinese and talk about how he was beating them up. But it was Americans who paid those tariffs. The people who suffer the most from supply management are Canadians.
How would revoking income surtaxes and taxes on intercorporate dividends help balance the budget? It sounds like it would make it more difficult to do so.
Those taxes are in that category that I talked about earlier, where we've had kind of populist. There's no tax policy reason why you would tax financial services differently from other companies. There's no tax policy reason why you would focus on intercorporate dividends received by them as opposed to dividends received by other investors. It's just because people were upset with the banks coming out of COVID because they seemed to do quite well, and given the macro environment where we were in, where the Bank of Canada reduced interest rates close to zero and was pumping all this money out. Yes, it did buoy up the financial sector. So, that was a well-founded perception, but to respond to it with tax policy just makes no sense at all. And when you think of some of the particulars of it, including the intercorporate dividends, people will rearrange their affairs to avoid paying that tax. The banks that are holding those securities will unload them to somebody else. These taxes have very high costs relative to the revenue they raise. And since there's no good tax policy reason to have them, just get rid of them. Our corporate income taxes should be lower, not higher.
Don, the shadow budget wants to rein in expenses, but also believes competitive compensation for federal employees is necessary. And Bill touched on this, that we've seen the federal government grow by, a third or so over the course of the last several years. How does the shadow budget align federal compensation with the private sector and what is expected to be the fiscal impact of a measure like that. We want to shrink the number of people working at the federal level, but we want to pay them more at the same time.
Well, I'm borrowing a lesson. I'm going to really date myself. Bill said he was a retro guy. I'm going way back to 1995 because a lesson we learned in the so-called program review at that time was not to prescribe too finely how departments are going to save their money. And I would just say to a department, your operating budget is frozen. Figure it out. And in some cases, if they have a need, they will actually hire more people. In most cases, they will probably try to downsell their load. But you don't, look what happened in Ontario where they tried to impose the 3-year limit on pay increases. They ended up being found unconstitutional. Now they're having the arbitrators are giving them retroactive pays. It didn't accomplish none of the hiring freezes per se, the overriding negotiation. None of these things have had an enduring effect. You give them sort of our approach on a micro level of a role, set an overall envelope and stay within that envelope, set an envelope for the departments or for the activities, let them figure out how to deal with it effectively. And it may be more people, it may be more likely than not to be less people, but allow some flexibility to do that.
I would be very happy if there were fewer federal public servants and the high performers were paid better than they are. One of the areas of compensation that we do talk about, but not in a lot of detail in the shadow budget, is for the federal government to go to the same kind of shared governance pension plan that you see in so many other areas, including many of the provincial governments. This has become quite a common model in the public sector in Canada, and it's quite a successful one. Ontario Teachers was the first, but there are dozens of them now. The federal government really stands out for the fact that it still has a very old style defined benefit pension plan, no flexibility in it. A lot of the costs are hidden. So in addition to rejigging the compensation, fewer people, but some of the better performers certainly better paid than they were before. I would like to see a change in the mix of the compensation. I think it makes sense to pay more incurred salary to your high performers, but move it into a pension plan where the federal public servants are a bit more in the same boat as other Canadians instead of in this peculiar pension plan that really rewards them for retiring earlier than they ought to, instead of paying them a good compensation while they're working.
I want to pivot to the pressure of population growth on housing and healthcare. What changes would the shadow budget suggest we adopt to manage the influx of new permanent residents and foreign workers to alleviate these pressures?
Well, it may seem a little bit arbitrary, but we sort of picked out of the air. Let's go back to 350,000 per year. We clearly cannot successfully absorb 500, 600. And, the number is almost 1 million when you include the temporary foreign workers and the international students off a population of 40 million. We have 14% of Canadian adults do not have access to regular access to a primary caregiver. We know the difficulty and affordability of housing. And we keep talking about housing, but let's not forget the average rent in Canada, large and small rural, is $2,100 a month. Over that, in fact, for a one-bedroom apartment. So you can't afford to rent either. And we talk about this intergenerational transfer. Good luck coming out of university or college or high school, getting a job and be able to afford any of these kind of basic necessities. It's too many people. It's difficult to successfully integrate them. We don't have that basic infrastructure in our housing stock. I mean, we've been building around 225,000 at the top, 250,000 housing units. How in the world do we bring in 1 million people when we've already got an imbalance on top of that? So we're saying, immigration's fine. That's a good thing. Let's make it work very well, but let's pull back on the numbers and make it work. But, we have to finish off the action on the international foreign students. The government's forced the universities and particularly the colleges to go the route of the international students because they froze the tuition of the domestic students and froze the grants. So this became their only means of balancing their budgets. So they're suffering now with this pullback and then the freeze on them. So they've got a big financial problem. That was the right thing to do, I think. And we saw this study, the Auditor General just pointed out from the Statistics Canada study, that as many as 1 in 4 of the international students in private colleges have never even ever enrolled in the course. So as the minister himself, the system got really out of hand, absolutely out of hand. pull it back, make it work better, more modest numbers for a while, get that behind us, and then move. But we have to deal with this access to healthcare, and we have to deal with the affordable housing thing first.
I will just say quickly, Michael, again, it's not an obvious thing to put in a shadow budget, but it just seems so important to us. We don't elaborate very much, but Canada's immigration system has been so successful over time. We have relied for economic applicants, which are a substantial chunk of the new permanent residents every year. We've relied on the point system to screen people for attributes that we know from experience are likely to help them thrive in Canada. In order to make these much larger numbers for permanent residents, the government has really gutted that system. The point system isn't working the way that it used to. And as Don's just been discussing, we've had this very large influx of temporary foreign workers and students who aren't coming in out of that system. I worry that as these stresses on housing and healthcare are becoming more in people's faces, we're in danger of losing that political support for a robust immigration system that's been such an asset for us. So I do think the government needs to ramp back their ambitions, whatever it was they thought they were doing on the temporary side. We now have a lot of people overstaying their visas. We've actually lost count of the number of temporary people that are in Canada. And so that's a problem. It's bigger than a shadow budget. But coming back to the housing thing particularly, we were just thinking there's a variety of factors that are stoking housing demand but not helping housing supply. This is one of the ones that the government should do something about.
I'm going to ask from each of you for a single sentence, which I know is difficult to ask of an economist, but for Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland, who we know is watching, what would you say is the key takeaway for her as she crafts her budget? Don?
We have serious problems. We need serious answers. That's it.
Bill?
Yep. I don't think if she is listening, she may stop listening when I say this, but I think that the federal government should balance the budget. That's how you demonstrate that you're serious. We've seen these other fiscal anchors, projected debt to GDP ratios, stuff like that. Clearly, they're sea anchors at best. They drift with the weather. We need something that's right down there on the rock and holds you in place.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bill Robson is the CEO of the C.D. Howe Institute and a co-author of the report alongside Don Drummond, the Stauffer Dunning Fellow at the Queen's University and Fellow in Residence at the C.D. Howe Institute. The commentary is titled Less for Ottawa, More for Canadians. It was also co-authored by Alex Laurent and can be found at cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.